So last year my family went and served at a camp. We do this every year. And it was at a conference center that had a shelf of books in the room where I was doing the teaching that said free books. So I looked through it. I found a book called No Man in Eden. And it was a delightful surprise of a sci-fi book that it was written long, long ago, 60s. Well, I'm back. And I'm at the same place. And I was in their library. So it wasn't a book that I was able to take and keep, but it was a book that I was able to check out. And I found another old Christian sci-fi book, and I can't wait to talk about it with you. Hey, I'm Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens. One of the things that I like to do on this video channel is to talk about Christian fiction books and ask the question, is it worth reading? And so I spent time talking about C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. I spent time talking about independent authors who are publishing stuff now that I think you should read. And I've also been looking for old school discoveries of old science fiction, and primarily this is being driven by my love of the Space Trilogy, and so I'm trying to find other things that come from way back then. This is a book that was written in 1981, and it was republished in the year 2000. So this is a 40-year-old book, 40-plus-year-old book, but I was in the library, and they had a section in this library that they have. There's, it's about 8, 9 shelving units of books, and there's a lot of romance. There's actually a couple shelves of Western, and they had a shelf of what they call fantasy, and basically that shelf is Left Behind. It's Left Behind. It's Tribulation Force. It's all those books, and then there was one paperback down there. It didn't fit in with the unified look of all the Left Behind books. And it's this book right here, and it's called WINTERFLIGHT. Now, WINTERFLIGHT, the title kind of threw me a little bit. I thought I was going to be reading about people who were trying to escape during the wintertime. But it's actually from the book of Matthew 24:20, where it says, "Pray ye that your flight be not in winter." He's talking about end times and just pray, saying, just hope that when things are going down, that you're not going to have to be running away when it's cold, when it's uncomfortable, or whatever. This book is interesting because it was written, like I said, or it was published rather in 1981. It was written in 1978 or so. This book is, I call it a domestic sci-fi book, and far more domestic than even That Hideous Strength, in that this is a story about a married couple, and they have a child. Their child has hemophilia, and they've been trying to hide it from the government because of forced abortions, and for people who grow up and have something go wrong with them, whether it's a genetic thing or a physical injury, they are put into organ banks. And it's like The Island, if you saw that movie. Only The Island is like cloning perfect replicas of people for their organs, and this is taking people who have no more use to society or who would be a burden on society and putting them in these organ banks. And then they also have euthanasia. So it also reminds me of Soylent Green or Logan's Run, where when you hit an age, I think it's 75, when you hit the age of 75, you get put into a lottery, and every year they draw random names out of this lottery, and that's how they decide who is going to be euthanized and who is going to die after the age of 75. And the idea is zero population growth. And the idea is, every family is allowed to have one child. Now, the book takes place at a time when the bicentennial had been just about 30 years ago. This is a sci-fi book that was looking into the future. It was trying to be vague, but it says specifically about 30 years after the bicentennial, meaning this book takes place in 2006. And so there's some interesting ideas, and at first glance you might think that it is a book that is just going to be written by Christians for Christians about how bad the world is and about how bad the world could get. I was just reading David Gerald's Worlds of Wonder. He was saying that science fiction asks what if, and it's not just the what if question. He broke it down into 2 what if questions that I really, really like. And it's like, what if this does happen? And then the other question that science fiction asks is, what if this continues to happen? What I like about that is because it does take these science fiction ideas and allows it to be not just about scientific discovery, but it also allows it to become, 1984, under that definition, is definitely a science fiction book because it's about what if our society here continues going in this direction. Logan's Run does both, what if as far as technology goes, but also what if things keep going the way it's going as far as the attitude of youth toward age, or the attitude of society toward age. And then the same with Soylent Green. It's that Soylent Green does ask some technological what ifs as you're looking into the future, but it also asks some sociological what ifs as far as what if this continues going in the direction it's going. And that's what this book does, is it asks those sociological what ifs as far as where the world is going. But where I thought it was just going to be a rah us, and we were the underdogs and we're going to be fighting against the system, that's there. It is there. But it also, for me, went a little bit beyond that. It is definitely a book that is written by a Christian for Christians. And actually, he has a note in the back of the book where he talks about how there's some things in the book that he was afraid people just were going to take too literally. The book does, euthanasia is a part of this, abortion is a part of this as far as topics that are brought up, but also suicide is brought up as a topic. And then there's a whole section about just how much do we obey the government when, Paul writes, the government officials have been placed over us, but then Paul also writes about how we need to make sure, once they start breaking God's laws, they no longer those are not, we're no longer obligated to obey those. And so there's back and forth about these things. And so this is a book that allows Christians to wrestle with some of these ideas, especially ideas as far as looking at how we interact with our government, how we interact with what's going on around us in the world. There's characters who are believers and they are judgmental. And there's characters who are believers and they are naive. There's characters who are believers and they are still learning. And there's characters who are believers and they are struggling with what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's untrue. And so I felt like what was good about this is, though, even though this book was written by Christians for Christians, I feel like it presented a broad spectrum of responses to what was going on in this world. Now, what is going on in this world? Well, first of all, church is not illegal, but some of the things churches might do is. Doctors can be put in prison for giving medical services to patients who have incurable diseases. And so the main characters, they have their son Stephen, who has hemophilia. And he falls and injures himself. And this is a bad injury that wouldn't necessarily be a bad injury for your typical child who doesn't have issues with their blood, but for him, it's life-threatening. And so they are desperate then to find out, what do we do and how do we go against the government in this? And can we find a doctor who's willing to go against the government? And the first person they go to, without giving away too much of the plot, the first person they go to is a doctor from their church who they consider a coward because he will not help because he's afraid to. In fact, he ends up talking about this problem to his colleagues. And as a result, they do get some help. And so you have a third main character who is a doctor who is willing to go against the government and help people who the government says he's not allowed to help. And he's doing so not out of Christian obligation. He's not a Christian. He's doing so out of moral obligation, though. And so there's some interesting give and take. It's not an exciting book, though. It's a book that, like I said, it's domestic. It is all about people in a house talking about their problem and trying to figure out their solution. And I really could see this actually being like a 1 hour Twilight Zone because of the type of problem that it has, where it's this kind of extrapolation of the not too distant future. But one of the reasons why this doctor wants to help people is because he has a son with Tay-Sachs syndrome. And they mention also Down syndrome is something that they've completely taken care of by not letting people be born with it. And it's an interesting thing because I remember when our 22-year-old son, wow, that's bad, I can't remember his actual age, but he's not going to be watching this, so it's okay. But our doctor said, we have these certain tests that you can do if you would like to. And we asked, well, why, what are those tests for? And he said, well, it's to find out if there's any genetic problems that we can find out before the child is born. And our doctor was a Christian, and he said, I'm telling you that you can get these tests done, but when we asked him what they were for, he was pretty frank with us, and he said, well, some people, if they find out the child has a genetic syndrome that they would have to live with, they choose to abort the baby. And so there's things in the book that are very prescient as far as looking into the future. And I found that very interesting. Well, the other thing I found really interesting as I'm reading this book is, and when that book would have been written, it would have been around the time when my dad was actually involved in disability ministry in Canada, where his job was to go into institutions and find people who had cognitive and sometimes cognitive and physical disabilities, and help them to come out of these institutionalized living and get into group home living, and then eventually move into independent living, where they would have someone who's checking up on them, but they would have a job and they would be able to go and get their groceries and everything like that. And so he was a part of that during, honestly, the time when this was written. And it's interesting then, because I am here at this camp, and this camp is for families affected by disability. And I'm reading these things in this book where the government is saying these things, making these judgments, pronouncing these things. And I'm just like, I've heard about some of this stuff, and I know how the world, how society looks at people with disabilities. It's something that, it's a spectrum that you get on, where you start learning and interacting and spending time with people with disabilities, where you're going from, kind of pity to a point where we call it, I guess there's a 5 stages of the spectrum there, and it's co-laboring, where you're actually doing life with people affected by disability. And that's the whole point of the ministry that I'm working with here, is to get to that point where you're doing life with each other, and where you're leading each other toward a closer relationship with God, with the Creator. And so reading this book, I found it very interesting, just the timing of finding that book here. And so the question, of course, is always, is it worth reading? Is WINTERFLIGHT worth reading? And I would say that it is a hesitant yes. This is not a must read. This is not a paralandra, okay, where you have to read this book if you are a believer, because of just the amazing things that it does. But it is the kind of thing that I feel like it was perfect for my situation, where I picked it up in the laundry room has the library, and so I imagine that there's a lot of times where that's just the ideal location for people to need books or to go look for books, is, families when they're here during the regular year for a week, and they need to go down and do laundry, and they bring the kids with them, and then there's a whole section of kids books, and keep the kids occupied while you're putting in laundry, but also checking out some books because you might want to go read it on the beach or whatever. And so this was for me, to discover it here, to not have to pay for it, to read it here in my spare time here and there. And I did find myself not wanting to stop reading. I wanted to see what was going to happen next, even though it wasn't an exciting thriller. All right, it was that domestic problems. It was, there's marriage problems, which is a big part of something that families deal with when they are affected by disability. Anyway, I was reading it in my spare time, and I found myself wanting to continue. And over the weekend, I got to read a whole bunch of it, and I just really, really enjoyed reading it. Now, that said, like I said, is it worth reading? Yes. Is it worth going out and finding it because it's a not miss, can't miss, must read? No. But if what I've described sound interesting to you, then I would definitely say, yeah, spend your time with it. It's good. And it does give you opportunity to wrestle with some of the issues. There was one standout quote where someone said, and I've never heard this before, just the difference between hope and faith. Hope is an attitude toward the circumstances, and faith is an attitude toward God. And I just loved that idea. Like I said, it does cover issues like euthanasia, abortion, disability. You have the organ banks. You have the Thanotel, which is the hotel you go to for euthanasia. And then there's some ideas here, I'll just read a couple of them, where it is the science fiction looking forward. One, they got right, electric cars. At the end of the book, they're in a car, and he wants to stop at Exxon, and he's getting snacks, but he doesn't want to take the time for a fast charge because it is an electric car. But then they talk about things like, I was watching the computer TV the other day, or I want to check this book out from the CompuLib. To waste some time, he talks about wanting to call up a game on the video computer. And then there was the video news printout. And so it was just these little details that definitely set it in the future, did it in such a vague way that for the most part, the verbiage that it uses, call up a game on the video computer, the verbiage is not something we would ever use. Computer TV, CompuLive, that's probably my favorite one. But then the video news printout, I'm like, I don't even know how that works. So the video news is on, but you're reading a printout of it. So I think it's you can watch the news and then take a printout, and that's something you can share back and forth after the news has happened or after they've gone past that particular story on the news. I don't know. But the point is, it's worth reading. But it's not something, I wouldn't call it homework. I don't think it's the kind of thing where you must read because it's homework, but you have to slog through it. I'd say if it's something you're going to slog through, stay away from it. But yeah, so that is WINTERFLIGHT by Joseph Bailey. WINTERFLIGHT by Joseph Bailey. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I also hope you check out the links. If you want to buy it, there's a link for this book from Amazon. It's a newer edition, but a link in Amazon. Until next time, thank you for spending time with me, and Godspeed.